Hey guys, so I'm back again today because a few people had more questions and that's awesome. So I wanted to get them to you as soon as possible so that you'd be able to continue on with your studying. So I did also want to show you both of these reviews for the tests are on my website, and I will also post this again on Classroom too. So, all right, part two. We're looking at similar topics again because, it's just the way the war kind of breaks up. So, for the first thing, terms to know fascism. Somebody asked about that. All that is a system of government that's very strict socially and economically. There's a really strong centralized government, usually a dictator. The first time we have one of these governments founded is in Italy by Mussolini, and other fascist dictatorships will pop up throughout the course of World War II. And before World War II as well. But this is like the most common one that we talk about, and obviously Mussolini is a big part of World War II. This whole concept is that everybody works for the betterment of the state, that the state is the one who's really important and not the individual. Typically in a fascist society, they're going to get rid of teachers, anyone who's educated, anyone who's creative. So like artists or musicians, they're going to go because they could spark ideas that are opposite to what the government wants to control. On the home front, internment camps. So I spoke before about Korematsu versus the US, and that comes from these internment camps. So after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there's a lot of distrust between the Americans and the American government and Japanese Americans, or just Japanese people who were living in America. So the government the president passes an executive order, which means that Congress does not have to agree to that, if you remember. And FDR makes like a sweeping declaration or an executive order that says they have to go into internment camps, which is like a relocation center. Remember how we talked about the Native Americans being relocated and being put onto reservations? I would argue it's something similar to that, but it's different still. Mostly this is happening on the West Coast. It's not all Japanese Americans, but it is a good chunk of them. And again, mostly on the West Coast because they're closer to Japan. They're convinced that people are still spies and everything else, but they're not. They have to give up their homes and businesses. A lot of them will sell it to somebody close to them just so that it's paperwork. And then this way, when they get out of these internment camps, they'll be able to like buy them back or however they wanted to work it out. Nobody is safe from this. If you were on the West Coast and even some other areas of the United States, not even World War I veterans, like if you were Japanese or Japanese American, you had to go to these internment camps. They really just had like a lack of hygiene there because they had no choice. They just didn't have those resources available to them. And a lot of people always ask, well, why didn't they just leave? Because there were armed like officers and stuff right outside the gates. So it was very hard for them to leave. There was no leaving. Some of them were allowed to leave for like certain jobs, but overall no one was really allowed to leave. Some people do die there from malnutrition, poor hygiene, or emotional distress. It causes other health issues. We know that when we get stressed, when our body gets stressed, we're more likely to be like prone to infection and things like that. So that's all part of it. And this is what leads to Korematsu versus the US. And I had said earlier that Fred Korematsu took this case all the way to the Supreme Court, and they told him to go to an internment camp. So that was the end of that. Like I said before, I did look it up in between. So like I said, it was almost 40 years later with Reagan, and it was $20,000 awarded to each living person who was in the internment camps. They don't actually get that money until the first President Bush was president. So that's the late 80s, early 90s. I don't know the exact date of that, but it takes some time. All right, during the war, so D-Day, we talked about battles before. This is a pretty important one. This is also known as Operation Overlord. If you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, there's that's not the opening scene, but one of the earlier scenes is them storming the beaches of Normandy, which is D-Day. I do recommend, just kind of Google it. They have it, the lips get like dubbed a little weird, but they do have it on YouTube. It's a 20-minute scene, and it's pretty accurate. I worked with someone whose grandfather stormed the beaches of Normandy, and he said it was pretty accurate, except in real life there was more blood. So, and there's a lot of blood in the scene. So if you get queasy, please don't watch it. But it's an awesome movie too, but yeah, very violent, just as a warning. Obviously, it's war. But so this is an Allied attack on the beaches of Normandy. The goal is to start the liberation of France. The goal is to get to Paris. So they keep it a secret and they get Hollywood involved in it. So what they're going to do is they're crossing the English Channel to get into France, to the beaches of Normandy. And they get Hollywood involved, and Hollywood actually makes like these fake inflatable, what looks like tanks and like garages to house those tanks and stuff, but they're all fake. So they get them involved in it, and they're able to make it look like they're going to come from a different spot across the channel. So the hope is that Germany will divert their forces, and they do. But the problem is Normandy is still designated by the Germans as like a high risk of invasion spot. Surprise, surprise, it was. When this happens, it's American, British, and Canadian soldiers. And they're storming 5 beaches that are codenamed. It's Omaha, Utah, Sword, Juno, and Gold. The easiest one to take is Utah, and the most difficult one is Omaha. And Omaha is the one that Saving Private Ryan is based on. It is the largest air, sea, and land invasion in history. It's an Allied victory. It's led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who is American. And they go in, and this starts the liberation of France. They work there. This is June 6th. By August 25th, they are in Paris, and they liberate Paris. And then, like I said earlier, with the Battle of the Bulge, that's when they go through the Ardennes forest, and they kind of work their way through. And that's the end, the last push of this invasion that they work their way through. Then you've got VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day. It's a day celebrating the formal acceptance by the Allies of the Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender of its armed forces. This is May 8th, 1945. And then now we move from the European theater to the Pacific theater. So with this war, we have 2 theaters of the war. We have the European theater, which also includes North Africa, and then we have the Pacific theater, which is Japan and the islands that go around in the Pacific. It makes sense, right? So for island hopping, it's a strategy of getting islands and going around others. They're going to kind of hop around to different islands. For some reason, when I was a kid, and honestly, like a young adult, in my head, island hopping meant that it was like marshy. So they were like hopping, but no. They would be at one island, and then they would take a boat or a plane or whatever and get to the next one. The biggest thing is it's very costly in terms of human life, as well as just military expenses, because just because you win on an island doesn't mean you get to take everything with you and go to the next one. It means you have to leave people there to protect the island and make sure they don't have a coup and try to rise up. Which leads us to the atomic bomb. So this is also known as the Manhattan Project, and you guys had to read those articles from Khan Academy about this. We know that Einstein is going to write to FDR about the Germans' plan to create the atomic bomb. Scientists here create it first, and they have the first tested explosion in New Mexico. President Truman decides ultimately to drop the bomb on Japan instead of sending the army to the mainland. This is with island hopping. So it was estimated that if American forces tried to go onto the mainland of Japan, that it would take anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million men, like, that would have to die before we could take the island. And that was too much to Truman, so what he decides instead is to drop the atomic bomb. There is a warning sent to Japan like, hey, surrender, do you surrender yet? And they say no. And then they drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. 3 days later, Nagasaki is bombed on August 9th of 1945. And a few days later, the Japanese will give their unconditional surrender as well. Fun fact, there is a few people, I believe there are 4 people who survived both bombings. And if you Google it, it's a really interesting article on one of the guys. He literally survived both. He was working in Hiroshima, but he lived in Nagasaki. Like, that's where he was from. So the first bomb drops, and he's there, and he lived, and he goes home to Nagasaki, and he's recovering, and the second bomb gets dropped. And it's like crazy. What are the odds? But there were 3 other men with him, too, with the same thing. So it's interesting if you want to, take a look. You guys know I'm a big history nerd, but definitely interesting. VJ Day is Victory in Japan Day. That's August 15th, 1945. So basically that's when news of their surrender is announced to the world. It's not a formal surrender. It's just like okay, hi, we give up now. And then they give their formal surrender on September 2nd. So Truman is actually originally going to declare VJ Day as September 2nd, but everybody celebrates August 15th, and that's why it ends up being August 15th. All right, and after the war, this is a big piece of it, the United Nations. So it's created after World War II. It's set up in August of 1945, and it does what the League of Nations can't. Right? We know the League of Nations is supposed to be set up to have a lasting peace, but that's not how it works. So the goals of the United Nations now is, I hate to say the same thing, but it's very similar. So they want to help solve problems before they become a war by finding solutions. We wanted that with the League of Nations, but it wasn't supported by some pretty important nations. This one opens, it's like membership to all of the nations who want to be like I'm not stopping because I'm 10 minutes in, so we're all just going to ignore that and pretend it didn't happen. The United Nations allows membership by any nation who is self-governing, so they would allow them into the United Nations, and they work together on diplomacy to solve their problems. They're working towards international peace and security, and they're working to maintain that as well. They develop and promote friendly relations among nations to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character. So that includes any crimes against humanity. We're going to talk as we move forward about different things that are brought to the UN that are crimes against humanity. The Holocaust would be one of them. To be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations and the attainment of these common ends, right? So to work all the nations together to meet all of those goals. The goal is for diplomacy, right? That's what they want. They want no more war. They're kind of tired of it. Ultimately, the important thing to note that at the end of World War II, there are two main superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And that's what's going to lead us straight into the Cold War, which is your next unit, which a lot of you have already started working on, which is wonderful. With the Cold War, it's these two nations silently threatening war. All right, and they might go to war through other areas, but they never go to war themselves. Overall, the United Nations does a better job in the League of Nations. I wouldn't say they're 100% perfect, but they do a better job than the League of Nations. And that's partially because of the involvement of other nations. So the United States is in it, Soviet Union is in it, all of those nations now can be in it together. You're also going to have Czechoslovakia brought back, Poland comes back, all of these nations, and they're all also represented. So that's it. If you guys have any more questions, please send them. I did this one tonight so that if you do have another one tomorrow, I am more than happy to make a part 3. I hope you're all doing well. And yeah, let me know if you guys have any questions.